So let's begin by exploring, the usual approach may be just to find the main method and see what it does and follow the code. So here's the main class, which contains the main method, and it simply invokes on the event dispatch thread. It simply invokes create and show GUI, and create and show GUI simply creates something that seems to have the title radio buttons demo, and that's our window, right? So frame radio buttons is the instance of the class that I think represents our window, and this is all we do. We just create a window and then wait for that window to begin to receive events. And it begins to receive those events as soon as the user begins to type or click or otherwise interact with the window. So here's this frame radio buttons class, which is also in place. So let's scroll this down and see what it includes. So this frame radio buttons, of course, is not the one that was designed by using NetBeans Designer. This is just was put together to represent a sample code for swing controls, and you can see that we're trying to use a couple of buttons. There's a panel, there's another panel, and there's the color class, which is a helper class to manage these background colors. Okay, so this is the set of attributes, and surprisingly, there isn't a control or a set of controls which would represent the radio buttons themselves. What I can see so far is this radio button panel, basically, which says this is a group of radio buttons. Essentially, I'm expecting and I'm anticipating this to be the container for these radio buttons. And so we need to explore further what happens to these radio buttons, how they're getting created, how they're getting manipulated internally, and who keeps track of them. So these are all questions that we need to answer. We also naturally have the constructor for our frame, right, which naturally takes the caption for or the title text for the window, and of course delegates its first thing is to the superclass, which is in our case this is frame application, which in its own turn is derived from the JFrame, and so we just pass this initial string to the list of chain constructors, so that the window is populated with an appropriate caption, right, or title. So then we say set grid layout. So that the set grid layout is a private method, not intended to be used outside of this frame with radio buttons. So it's a private method. But it does quite a bit of work, right? So besides just dealing with the grid layout, it seems to be creating different types of buttons and panels, and even adds listeners to these controls. So step by step, it creates the two panels. One panel is called main panel, another panel is the panel for radio buttons. And by the way, the type of the panel is group radio buttons. So the next thing is for us to look at this group radio buttons class. Push buttons are actually those conventional buttons that look like, rectangular forms on the form, on the top of the form, and then of course have the caption, right? Anyway, this class, this frame radio buttons class, seems to be the one that we're going to use to listen on events posted by these buttons. In other words, if someone clicks buttons change color, or if someone clicks button quit, we say that we want this frame radio buttons class to be the listener on these events. In other words, it should get notifications about these events. And look how the code passes the this reference to the add action listener methods. Basically, the this reference is referring to the frame, and we just basically tell this specific button should notify our frame about clicks or the default action performed, and likewise the quit button should do the same. And so we have that. So the main panel gets a number of things. First of all, we add a label which explains the user what to do. We also add these buttons to the main panel of the window, and we also ask the main panel what's the background color, and that background color is going to be remembered as the default system color for the form to display to the user, right? So here's when we create the grid layout, and this is done through an arrangement of 2 rows and 1 column. Basically, it's a very simple list-like arrangement, right? So we have 2 rows, and each of the row contains a single cell which can be populated with controls, and altogether this gives us a grid-like control of placement of everything that we do. And what we place there is that we add the 2 panels to that content of our frame. So so the main panel is created by this method, and you can see that it's created as new JPanel. So it's very simple panel that we'd like to have before we add any other button to it. But the second panel is named Group Radio Buttons, and it's now time for us to open Group Radio Buttons Java class and realize that what we did here is that we created class named Group Radio Buttons, which extends JPanel. So the question is, why would you want to create a panel which extends already existing JPanel to this point, up to this point prior? We were able to use JPanel directly, and it seemed to be a good choice. We can do our things, and remember that it was possible to do in the NetBeans form designer, but when we do our own programming and we want to perhaps use some additional features of the panel, the way to approach this is simply to derive your own subclass from JPanel and use JPanel as a superclass. So let's see what happens inside here. Quite a few things actually do happen inside this group of radio buttons, right? So there's quite a set of data attributes. So the data attributes specify the radio button listener. So remember, when we switch between those radio buttons, like click different radio buttons, and that radio button indicator moves up and down through the list of radio buttons, the actual clicks are going to be sent to this group of radio buttons JPanel derived class. Here are the actual radio buttons. Now they become visible. So there is a control named JRadio button. It's just another type of component, and we call them radio green, blue, and orange according to the colors that we'd like to assign them to make those changes. Interestingly, there's another control that's called button group. When I run this code, right, and you see how when I click buttons, one is selected and another one is instantly deselected. So clearly these radio buttons interact not with just the user but also with one another. They seem to be interconnected or otherwise aware of each other's presence, right? So I have two choices. After making orange my current selection, my choice is to go to blue, right? Or my choice is to go to green. But in either choice, I appropriately deselect the original setting and select the new one. So there's a very direct and simple awareness between these buttons of each other's existence. So it's an interesting sort of like an artifact that we observe, but and so let me quit at this point. But the way it's organized is that there is a special helper object which is not visible, right? It's not visible. It's a logical binding between the radio buttons, and it's called button group, right? So button group is part of the swing package, and this is we will see how it's going to be used and how it's going to keep track of the buttons, and it facilitates this select deselect interaction. Okay. We also decided that perhaps it could be useful that the radio buttons panel derived class that we have also has access to the frame itself for whatever reason, and also has access to the border. And this time it will be manipulating its own border, but once again the border is actually a helper class which allows us to access the properties of the JPanel border. And so this sample demonstrates techniques of how these features of visible gadgets can be manipulated and how they are going to be manipulated. So the next time you create a panel and you make a border visible and you switch to different properties of that border and do other things, you should be able to open the source code that NetBeans generates for you and be able to see that these components are going to be used there as well, because this is the way Swing is organized. So anyway, so these are some of the observations about the data attributes, and pretty much all of them are not primitive data types such as integer or Boolean. They're pretty much all references to other controls in our application.